April 16, 1945. It was a perfect spring morning in the German state of Thuringia. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The apple trees were beginning to blossom in the orchards surrounding the historic city of Weimar. If you were standing on the cobbled streets of the city center that morning, you would have seen a scene that looked less like a war and more like a society gala. Men in expensive wool suits and fedora hats were walking out of their front doors. Women in French fur coats, wearing lipstick and silk stockings, were adjusting their hair in the reflection of shop windows. They were the elite of Weimar. The bankers, the professors, the doctors, the wives of the city councilmen. They were chatting, smiling, complaining about the inconvenience. But if you looked closer, you would have seen the fear behind their smiles. Because flanking them on both sides were American military police jeeps with .50 caliber machine guns mounted on the back. Grim-faced soldiers from the United States Third Army were prodding them forward with the barrels of M1 Garand rifles. This wasn't a social gathering. It was an arrest. General George S. Patton had ordered the provost marshal to round up 1,000 of the wealthiest, most influential citizens of Weimar. He didn't want the workers. He didn't want the peasants. He wanted the aristocracy. He wanted the people who claimed to be the guardians of German culture. Their destination was a place they all swore they knew nothing about. A place located just 5 miles uphill, on a scenic ridge called the Eddersberg. A place called Buchenwald. The citizens complained as they were marched out of the city limits. "Why are we doing this?" one woman asked an American sergeant. "My shoes are getting dusty. I have a luncheon to attend." The sergeant just spit on the ground and pointed his rifle up the hill. "Start walking, lady. You're going to see your neighbors." This is the story of the parade of shame. It is the story of the day general. George Patton decided to shatter the great lie of the German population. It is the moment the cultural capital of Europe was forced to stare directly into the face of absolute evil, and the moment the smiles were wiped off the faces of the German elite forever. To understand the sheer brutality of what Patton did that day, you first have to understand the city of Weimar. This wasn't just any German town. Weimar was the soul of Germany. It was the city of Goethe and Schiller, the giants of literature. It was the birthplace of the Bauhaus movement, the center of modern art and architecture. It was a city of libraries, conservatories, and opera houses. The people who lived there prided themselves on being civilized. They listened to Beethoven in the park. They read philosophy in cafes. They believed they were the pinnacle of European sophistication. And yet, for 8 years, right there on the horizon, visible from their bedroom windows, smoke had been rising from the chimney of the Eddersberg. Buchenwald concentration camp was established in July 1937. It was one of the first and largest camps on German soil. It wasn't a secret. It was an industry. The SS officers who ran the camp lived in nice suburban villas on the outskirts of Weimar. Their wives shopped in the same boutiques as the Weimar elite. They went to the same hair salons. They sat in the same pews at church. The prisoners of Buchenwald were leased out as slave labor to local factories. They fixed the roads the citizens drove on. They loaded the trains the citizens rode on. And yet, when the American tanks rolled into Weimar on April 11, 1945, every single citizen said the same 4 words. Wir haben nichts gewusst. We knew nothing. They claimed the smoke was from a factory. They claimed the emaciated men in striped pajamas were criminals being rehabilitated. They lived in a bubble of willful denial, a psychological fortress that allowed them to enjoy their opera while human beings were being incinerated. 5 miles away, General George S. Patton arrived at Buchenwald on April 15, for days after its liberation. He was a man who had seen everything. He had seen the carnage of World War I. He had seen the bodies rotting in the sun in North Africa. He had walked through the frozen slaughterhouse of the Battle of the Bulge. He called himself Old Blood and Guts. He prided himself on being tougher than any man in his army. But Buchenwald broke him. When Patton walked through the Iron Gate with the cruel inscription Jedem das Seine, to each his own, He was hit by a wall of smell that made his knees buckle. It wasn't just the smell of death. It was the smell of decomposition, of dysentery, of burning hair, of unwashed bodies crammed into barracks meant for horses. Patton walked past the roll call square and saw the pile. It was a stack of bodies, naked, yellow-skinned, skeletons with skin stretched tight over bone. They were stacked like cordwood, 5 feet high, 20 feet long. Their eyes were open. Their mouths were frozen in silent screams. Patton stopped. He turned away. His aides saw his shoulders heaving. The toughest general in the United States Army walked behind a barracks and vomited until there was nothing left in his stomach. But when he stood up, the sickness was gone, replaced by a cold, shaking fury. He looked out over the fence at the beautiful city of Weimar in the valley below. He saw the smoke rising from the chimneys of the houses. He saw the laundry hanging on the lines. He saw the farmers plowing the fields. He turned to the camp commandant, a liberated prisoner who had taken charge. "Do the people in that town know about this?" Patton asked, pointing with his riding crop. The prisoner replied, "They say they don't, General. They say they never looked up the hill." Patton's face turned a shade of red that his staff knew meant violence was coming. He slammed his riding crop against his boot. "They are lying," he growled. "And I am going to prove it." Patton didn't just want to punish the SS. The SS were gone, or dead, or captured. He wanted to punish the enablers. He wanted to punish the silence. He called his provost marshal and gave an order that was unique in the history of warfare. He didn't order an artillery bombardment. He didn't order a tactical maneuver. He ordered a tour. "Go into Weimar," Patton commanded. "I want 1,000 people. But not just anyone. I want the cream of the crop. Get the mayor. Get the city council. Get the businessmen. Get their wives. Especially the wives. Tell them General Patton invites them to a picnic." The MPs moved out immediately. They rolled into Weimar with trucks and jeeps. They went to the wealthy districts. They knocked on the doors of the grand villas. When the citizens opened the doors, expecting perhaps a request for billeting or supplies, they were met with the barrel of a rifle. "Rouse," the soldiers said. "Get out. Walk." The Germans were confused. Some were indignant. "I am a doctor," one man shouted, adjusting his silk tie. "You cannot order me around like a common criminal." The MP just smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "Today, you're not a doctor. Today, you're a witness. Move." It was a strange sight. A column of 1,000 well-dressed civilians marching up the Eddersberg Hill. The mood among the Germans was light, almost festive. They were chatting. They were laughing. Some women were fixing their hair, checking their makeup in compact mirrors. They treated it like a nuisance, a silly American game. They thought it was a propaganda stunt. They smiled at the Signal Corps cameramen who were filming them. They had no idea that they were walking into a nightmare. The march took about 2 hours. The road wound up through the trees, the same road the SS trucks had used to carry prisoners to their deaths. As they got closer to the top of the hill, the conversation stopped. The wind changed direction. The smell hit them. It was a physical blow. The women stopped, smiling. They pulled out handkerchiefs, perfumed scarves, lace gloves. They tried to cover their noses. They gagged. The laughter died instantly. The MPs pushed them forward. "Keep moving," they shouted. "No stopping." They reached the main gate. The civilians walked through, and they stepped into hell. The first thing they saw was the survivors. Thousands of them. Men who weighed 60 pounds. Men who couldn't stand. They were leaning against the barbed wire, watching the parade. These were the men the citizens claimed didn't exist. They stared at the fur coats and the suits with eyes that were ancient and dead. They didn't scream. They didn't attack. They just stared. And that stare was more terrifying than any weapon. It was the stare of judgment. The American soldiers formed a cordon, A human hallway lined with rifles, forcing the civilians to walk a specific path. Patton had designed the route personally. He wanted a crescendo of horror. The first stop was the barracks. The soldiers forced the civilians to look inside. They saw the wooden bunks, stacked 4 high, where men slept in their own filth. They saw the sick, the dying, the men too weak to move. One German woman in a fur coat tried to look away. An American soldier grabbed her chin. Rough. Angry. He forced her head back. "Look," he shouted in broken German. "Look at what you did." She started to cry, but the soldier didn't let go until she opened her eyes. The tour continued to the roll call square. The pile of bodies was still there. Patton had ordered that they not be moved. He wanted them fresh. The civilians had to walk within 3 feet of the stack. The flies were buzzing. The smell was overpowering. The men in suits were weeping openly now. Some were vomiting in the mud, ruining their polished shoes. One man, a banker by the look of him, fell to his knees and started praying. An MP kicked him in the ribs. "Get up," the MP said. "You can pray later. Right now, you watch." But the worst was yet to come. Patton had ordered a special display in the pathology lab. The SS at Buchenwald were not just murderers, they were perverts. The commandant's wife, Ilse Koch, known as the Bitch of Buchenwald, had a particular fascination with human skin. She liked tattoos. When a prisoner arrived with interesting ink, she would order him killed so she could have the skin tanned and turned into household items. On a table in the center of the room, displayed like items in a department store window, were the artifacts of the SS. There were lampshades made of human skin. There were book covers made of human skin. There were 2 shrunken heads, the heads of Polish prisoners, preserved in jars. The civilians filed past the table. They stared at the lampshades. They realized what they were looking at. The horror was absolute. A woman screamed. A high, piercing shriek that cut through the camp. She fainted, collapsing onto the floor. The soldiers didn't help her. They stepped over her. "Keep moving," they yelled. Next. An American officer stood by the table. He spoke perfect German. He looked the civilians in the eye as they passed. "You say you didn't know?" he asked quietly. "These were made here. In your backyard. While you went to the theater. While you drank your coffee. This is your culture." The civilians had no answer. Their denial had been stripped away. They were naked in their guilt. They couldn't hide behind "we didn't know" anymore because the evidence was staring them in the face. A former prisoner, a skeleton of a man in ragged stripes, walked up to a well-dressed German man. He pointed a shaking finger at him. "I remember you," the prisoner said, his voice a dry rasp. "I worked at the train station unloading the coal. I saw you on the platform. You saw me. You looked away." The German man broke down. He sobbed uncontrollably. "I didn't know. I didn't know." But nobody believed him. Not the soldiers. Not the prisoners. And in that moment, not even himself. By the time the tour ended, the 1,000 citizens of Weimar were destroyed. They walked out of the gate in silence. No one was chatting. No one was smiling. The women's makeup was streaked with tears and dirt. The men's suits were dusty and stained. They walked back down the hill, back to their beautiful city of poets. But the city would never look the same to them again. Every time they looked at the hill, they would see the bodies. They would smell the burning. Patton was told about their reaction. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply nodded grimly. "Good," he said. "Maybe the rest of them will learn." But the lesson was too strong for some. That night, back in Weimar, the shame was too much to bear. The suicides began. Just like in the town of Ohrdruf a week earlier, the guilt claimed lives. The mayor of a neighboring town who had been on the tour went home, sat in his living room with his wife, and they slit their wrists together. They left a note saying they could not live with the shame of what they had seen. Several other prominent citizens took cyanide or hanged themselves in their attics. They realized that their culture, their education, their civilization had failed to stop them from becoming monsters. They couldn't live with the reflection in the mirror. When Patton heard about the suicides, he showed no pity. "That's 2 less Nazis we have to feed," he reportedly said. It sounds cruel. It sounds heartless. But you have to remember what Patton had just seen. He had seen the ovens. He had seen the children starve to death. He had seen the hooks on the wall where men were strangled. He had no tears left for the people who let it happen. Eisenhower supported Patton completely. In fact, he expanded the order. He realized that what Patton did was essential for history. He sent a cable to Washington and London immediately. "Send the press," he ordered. "Send the congressmen. Send the parliament members. Send the editors of the newspapers." He famously said, "I want every American unit not actually in the front lines to see this place. We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." Eisenhower predicted the future. He said, "Get it all on record now, get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road of history some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." He was right. Today, there are people who deny the Holocaust. There are people who say it was exaggerated. But because Patton forced those 1,000 civilians to walk through Buchenwald, and because Eisenhower filmed it, we have the proof. We have the footage of the German civilians crying. We have the footage of them fainting. We have the footage of them being confronted by the skeletons they tried to ignore. The forced tour of Buchenwald was not a legal proceeding. It wasn't a trial. It was a moral reckoning. It raises a question that we still ask today. How much does the average citizen know about the crimes of their government? The people of Weimar weren't the ones pulling the trigger. They weren't the ones turning on the gas. But they were the ones who looked away. They were the ones who stayed silent when their neighbors disappeared. They were the ones who benefited from the slave labor. Patton understood that silence is complicity. He understood that you cannot claim innocence just because you closed your eyes. On that day in April 1945, he forced them to open their eyes. And in doing so, he forced the world to open its eyes too. The citizens of Weimar walked up that hill as arrogant aristocrats. They walked down as broken accomplices. And the ghost of Buchenwald followed them home. It sat at their dinner tables. It slept in their beds. It watched them from the mirror. General George S. Patton is remembered for his tanks. He is remembered for his pearl-handled pistols. He is remembered for his speeches about blood and guts. But on that sunny day in April 1945, he wasn't a general. He was a human being confronted with pure evil. And his response wasn't to look away. His response was to grab the evil by the neck and force the world to look at it. He made sure that "I didn't know" would never be a valid excuse again. The parade of shame was his final victory in Europe. He didn't defeat a German army that day. He defeated the German lie. And as the sun set over Weimar that evening, the smoke from the Eddersberg finally stopped, but the memory of what happened there was burned into the soul of the city forever. The question remains for us today. If we lived 5 miles from hell, would we look up the hill? Or would we close our curtains and listen to the music? Patton forced them to look. History forces us to remember. This was the day the denial died. This was the day the rich and famous paid the price for their silence. And this is why George Patton was the only man who could have ended the war the way he did. Not with a treaty, but with the truth.